Okay, so now you can start seeing the connections between the U.S. Civil War, Mexico, and France. And this is again something that had been lost, and I'm very happy I was one of the people that kind of helped bring it back to the fore. But the point being that the Civil War doesn't happen in a box that's bound by the United States, that the implications of the Civil War are transnational, and the consequences of the Civil War are transnational as well. And so basically, what this means is that the outbreak in the Civil War in the United States opens up the door for Napoleon III to send an army into Mexico, what we call the French intervention. And so the Civil War has a huge consequence, the U.S. Civil War, on Mexico and on France as well. And as I'm going to talk about, incidents in Mexico and France also will bounce back and have a very important consequences for the United States as well. So the point I'm trying to make is the Civil War is part of a larger global struggle. So, I set up this in the first podcast that you've got kind of kingship versus democracy. This is the global struggle. You have it in Europe, you have it in Central, South, the Western Hemisphere. You have it in Asia. But here's how it takes form in the Western Hemisphere in particular. Napoleon III's game plan was he was going to send an army into Mexico, which he did in very early 1862, and he was going to install a king in Mexico. And the person that he had chosen, kind of the hapless person that he had chosen, is a guy by the name of Maximilian of Austria. Okay, so you might be wondering, why does a French emperor, that's what he styled himself, Napoleon III, why does he choose an Austrian to become basically the monarch in Mexico? Well, there's very complicated political reasons for this. There was nobody in France that could really do the job. And Napoleon III, he was trying to curry favor with the Hungarian Empire. Maximilian was the brother of the emperor of the Austria-Hungarian Empire. And basically, of all the aristocrats in Europe, Maximilian was the guy that fit the bill best for Napoleon III's purposes. But what you have to realize is that Maximilian was Napoleon III's puppet. Okay, Maximilian had very, very little autonomy on his own because he was backed by the French army. And once the French army pulls its support from Maximilian, which it does in 1867, it leads to Maximilian's downfall and his execution. He's executed in June of 1867. Okay, so let's go back to 1862. So Napoleon III sees a chance to reintroduce monarchical form of government in Mexico and then by extension in the Western Hemisphere because of the Civil War. This had not been possible before the Civil War because of the Monroe Doctrine. The U.S. told Europe to stay out of the Western Hemisphere. Lincoln can't enforce the Monroe Doctrine because of the Civil War. Napoleon III sees an opening. He'd had his eye on Mexico for decades, and he takes advantage of it. He takes advantage of it. And in early 1862, he sends an army, a French army of probably about less than 10,000 men, into Mexico via Veracruz. It's really, we talk about the French intervention into Mexico. What we should really call it is the French invasion of Mexico. Intervention kind of pretties up what was a raw political power play on the part of Napoleon III. Okay, so let's step back for a second and let's think about geography here. Okay, in 1862, the northern neighbor of Mexico was no longer the United States of America because the country had broken up in half. The northern neighbor of Mexico was the Confederate States of America, right? and especially Texas. That was the Texas was the key area along the border because there were very few people in New Mexico and Arizona and Southern California at this point. So we're really talking about Texas. So the border of Mexico, and again, remember, Mexico is a Republican government. Benito Juarez is he had been elected president of Mexico via constitutional means. So we tend to forget, especially in the United States, that Mexico was a democracy as well. Now, of course, it was a very flawed democracy, not that ours is perfect, but what you had had in Mexico ever since independence from Spain was complete chaos. You over 40 governments between the 1820s and the 1860s. In 1861, coincidentally, Mexico had just finished its own 3-year civil war between liberals and conservatives, a civil war that Juarez won. So when Napoleon III, when he looks at Mexico, he sees a country that is in total chaos, that has just come out of a very vicious civil war. Napoleon III is deeply racist. When he looks at Mexico, he sees that much of the Mexican population is still indigenous, it's native. Other Mexicans are mixed mestizo, Indian, Spanish, some African blood. So Napoleon III, he has nothing but contempt for the Mexican people. He thinks they're degenerate. He thinks that they don't have any kind of capacity to govern themselves. And, in truth, Mexico really had struggled. Although Mexicans are really going to surprise him because they basically defeat his effort. Which he didn't expect in a million years. He thought when he invaded Mexico that it would be easy, that taking Mexico would just be a piece of cake. He was sure that his army would be welcomed as liberators, and that Mexicans of all kinds would rally to Maximilian as their new king. He really underestimated, Napoleon III underestimated very, very dramatically the bonds that Mexicans had to democratic government, to democracy, and to Benito Juarez, who was the elected president of Mexico. Okay, so what happens is that Napoleon III sends troops into Mexico in early 1862, so a little less than a year after the Civil War starts. The stated reason he does this is that Juarez, when he came back into power in 1861, when he actually came back into Mexico City in 1861, Mexico had no money. Mexico owed Spain and England and France huge amounts of money that it just couldn't pay back. And so what Juarez does, he suspends payment on these debts. He says, look, we can't pay you back right now because we don't have any money. So we're going to stop paying you back for just a little bit. But once we get our footing, we'll start paying you back again. So you will be paid back. Well, Napoleon used this, the fact that Juarez had stopped paying the debt he owed England, France, and Spain. He used this to convince Spain and England to help him invade Mexico. Okay, very, very quickly, though, Spain and England smell a rat. They realize that Napoleon III has much more in mind than just getting the money that's owed France by the Mexican government and other Mexicans. That Napoleon III has decided he wants to go into Mexico and plug in an emperor, overthrow Benito Juarez, the democratically elected president of Mexico, and put in Maximilian of Austria as the French puppet in Mexico, as the emperor of Mexico, basically as the king of Mexico. And, this is kind of remarkable if you think about it, because there had been no monarchy that had come into the Western Hemisphere since 1776. The tide had gone the other way after 1776. The British are kicked out first, and then the Spanish are kicked out. So one of the ways you might want to look at what Napoleon is doing. Maximilian was really his puppet. He's really leading a counter-revolution against democratic government in the Western Hemisphere. He's leading a counter-revolution against the legacy of 1776, when first of all the British were kicked out, and then 40 years later, 50 years later, the Spanish were kicked out. Another way to look at it is this. What if the Soviet Union had put in a communist government in Mexico City in the 1960s, not the 1860s? Think about how the United States would have freaked out. Think about how the U.S. has freaked out over Cuba since Fidel Castro seized power in the late 1950s. That's one way to think about the danger here. And again, I think it's hard for students of today to kind of recapture how dangerous Napoleon III's move was, because I think students, and not just students, I think historians as well, have just assumed that democracy was going to win out, that it was always going to be the winner. But it did not look that way in the 1860s. It looked like democracy was on the ropes. The U.S. had split in half, and now in early 1862, you have this invasion of Mexico led by a French emperor who, with every intention of putting a European aristocrat as the king or as the emperor of Mexico. So what I'm saying here is that what Napoleon III is doing, it's part of that global war of democracy versus kingship, right? That global war now has moved into neighboring Mexico. And what has allowed that to happen? The Civil War in the United States. So that's what made it seem very, very insidious to many people in the world. That what Napoleon III is doing is he's bringing that global struggle into North America, directly into North America, by trying to establish a European emperor in Mexico.